For today's topic, we'll be taking a look at R.G. Frey's article, Moral Standing, the Value of Lives, and Speciesism. And if you think that's an awkward word to say, try spelling it. It's quite awkward. This article is a sort of response to Norcross's Puppies, Pigs, and People, which certainly wins in the alliteration department, but we're going to take a look at the kinds of position that can oppose something like Norcross's argument here. So the author, R.G. Frey, was a longtime professor of ethics at Bowling Green State University, which is a really outstanding applied ethics program. He died in 2012. It's not very long ago. He's going to start out the paper by talking about saying what he's defending, right? You should always, again, start a paper by saying, here's what I'm up to here. And Frey does that. He says, here's what I'm up to. I intend to defend a thing called the unequal value thesis. And the unequal value thesis has three parts, of which are these, right? So first off, he's going to say animal life, he says, has some value. Okay, and this separates him from somebody like, I guess, sort of a classic Kantian, although, again, even Kant didn't like that implication that his views seem to have. But again, the idea that animal life has some value, right? So he will defend that idea. He will say that not all animal life has the same value. And of course, when he says animal here, he means this is short for the longer phrase non-human animal, right? And again, he's going to say that. So for example, snails, cockroaches, mice, cats, dogs, all their lives aren't equally valuable to one another's, right? This is not all animal life has the same value. Interestingly enough, he also mentions as a big part of his account later that not all human life actually has the same value. But he does say that human life is more valuable than animal life. And again, he's going to say this is sort of an in general thing, and he's going to end up clarifying that third claim most often. But these three parts give the basic idea of what he's going to be trying to defend here, which is known as the unequal value thesis. And so he's going to start off. If you think, okay, so how is he going to respond to somebody like Norcross or Peter Singer, who very famously argues something for total species equality morally? And so one of the things that Frey is going to start by doing is actually agreeing with someone like Norcross or another utilitarian. He sort of very importantly just grants, right, that human and animal suffering are equivalent, right? So he says, look, if there's a pain that's felt, it doesn't matter who it's felt by or what species that it's felt by. Pain is pain, right? And then suffering is suffering. So all suffering is equivalent, okay? But he is going to deny that human and animal life are equivalent. So there is a distinction here between suffering and life. All right, so much of the first section of the paper is concerned with these two related concepts of presumption and of the burden of proof. And if you don't sort of get into a lot of formal arguments or argue in formal settings or write a lot of argumentative papers or something like that, you've probably not really given a whole lot of thought to ideas about presumption and burden of proof. If you have done some of those things, great, right? Then you have given some thought to that. But the idea is this, that it's sometimes important to lay out the groundwork when you're providing a kind of argument, when you're trying to be persuasive, to say, okay, where's our presumption here? Like, who actually has to prove what to whom, right? That's always a useful thing to ask if someone's trying to prove something. And so we'll start with an analogy of where presumption is most often used. Okay, so presumption, the word presumption means it's sort of the default position on a given issue. It's the thing that you're going to assume unless it's proven otherwise, right? That's what the presumption is. And the burden of proof is on somebody who tries to shift that presumption, who says, okay, look, the presumption is this. I have the burden to prove otherwise, so that's what I'm going to try and do. Okay, so for example, in a criminal trial, this is the most common case where we talk about a presumption of one kind or another. They talk about lawyers and people who talk about trials will talk about the presumption of innocence. Okay, so in a criminal trial, the presumption is that the accused, okay, is innocent until proven otherwise. Okay, and so that's that's what they mean by the presumption of innocence. The default position is that the person is innocent, and you have to sort of prove to some extent, and again, depending on the criminal trial, in most criminal proceedings, the standard is what's called a reasonable doubt standard. So you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. There are other kinds of standards used for other kinds of proceedings, and other presumptions used for other proceedings. Okay, it's not every time somebody's in a courtroom is the presumption in favor of innocence, right? There are other wrinkles and stuff like that. And go ask a lawyer, talk to them. They'll love it when you ask them questions about the law. So in any case, the fact that there's a presumption of innocence in a standard criminal trial means that the burden of proof then is on the prosecution. Okay, they have the job to prove something that will shift our belief away from the presumption. Okay, so Frey is going to be talking about where our presumption lies on issues of animal rights and the moral status of non-human animals. And so Frey's position actually may be a little bit surprising, again, given that he is going to be an opponent of an argument like Singer's famous argument, or like Norcross's argument that you've seen. Frey's position is going to be that the presumption should be against, for example, the use of animals in research, right? And so this is a departure, I think, from other advocates of the unequal value thesis. I think a lot of other articles, certainly that I've seen, that defend something like this unequal value thesis, think that the presumption should be that that these sorts of things, using animals for research, et cetera, is okay, unless you can come up with some good reason why it isn't. And Frey thinks the other way, right? He thinks the presumption should be that it's not okay to use animals for some purpose like this, unless there's some good reason to do so, right? Unless you can demonstrate some really good reason. So the presumption is that such things are not morally acceptable. Again, it's a very interesting position to start from, given his ultimate position here. And so he's going to move on from that, a lot of that talk about presumption, into his sort of main point of the paper, which concerns the value of a life. Okay, so mostly this is section 2 of the paper. And in this paper, the author argues that the value of a life consists in its richness, okay, which is going to be defined roughly as the capacity for autonomously pursuing different conceptions of the good life, right? And he gives a lot of very nice examples about, about how basically everybody, every sort of normal adult human person does this, and it doesn't require great education, it doesn't require great wisdom. It's just one of those things we sort of can't help doing, right? Choosing what to make of ourselves and our lives, and that's something that defines the richness of a life, is the capacity for doing just that. Right, so that's a very important part of his conception, and of course we do know that humans do this almost universally. That almost is going to be a keyword for where he'll be going later, and he points out again something that's very interesting. He says, look, we don't really have any reason to think that rabbits, for example, he uses rabbits often as a sort of example non-human animal, do this, that they don't seem to to want to make something of their lives or exhibit some sort of autonomy of choice, or and of course there's always the position that says, well, how do you know? Have you ever been a rabbit, right? Or have you ever read Watership Down? Those rabbits seem to have, anyway. But look, this is a reasonable argument. Here's an argument that he considers. He says, look, if you're going to go from the skeptical position of we have no idea, okay, what rabbits do and don't think, and how they do and don't experience their lives, to some level this is simply true. However, if it's true, then we still have to have some reasons, okay, for regarding rabbits in a particular way or not. And then if we want to just say, look, we have no idea, we have to ignore much of the evidence that we do have about rabbit behavior. So again, it's a fair point, he says, but it's a point that where the assumptions seem to be a little bit backward, or asked us to make certain kind of assumptions, not only without good reasons, but against good reasons for assuming otherwise. And that's this is what he's discussing here, is this thing called the skeptical assumption. Okay, and so this is the argument that makes use of the cautionary principle, right? The cautionary principle is the better safe than sorry principle. And so the argument goes something like this. Okay, if we don't really know what the lives of non-human animals, such as rabbits, for example, are like, then either they are much more like our own than we think, and then it would be sort of wrong to do many of the things that we sort of routinely do, or they aren't, right? And then it's, perhaps not wrong to do those things. But since we don't know, right, it's better to sort of, avoid using rabbits for medical research, for example, or rats or whatever. And it's better not to, to kill and eat them. It's better not to, et cetera, right? All these various kinds of things. Better not to keep them as pets, better not to, et cetera. So the idea is that because we don't know, it's better to just not do any of those things and be sort of on the safe side, morally speaking. Now, look, this is it's not a dumb argument, but it is one that I think really sort of abuses the cautionary principle. For the most part, the cautionary principle it can be handy, right? But think of applying it in a way that we don't generally apply, right? Think of applying it in this strictly, because it sounds reasonable in one kind of an example, but doesn't in another. So, for example, you might say, okay, look, if the value of a human life is infinite, right, which is a thing that people say often, then it would seem like anything that risks any human life is going to be bad. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry, right? Well, okay, so let's start by eliminating all of the things that tend to cause deaths, right? So, things like elevators, okay, more people die from, elevator accidents than some things, at least, right? At least there's some chance, right, of dying in an elevator accident. So no elevators, right? Stairs actually are probably statistically more dangerous than elevators, I'm guessing, just because they're probably in more common use. So no stairs, just build everything ground level, right? No problem. You got things like, bathtubs, people do slip in those, no bathtubs, okay? Better safe than sorry. Okay, no cars, certainly, God, cars. Bicycles, canoes, nope. Just foot power. And of course, sometimes walking, people will have accidents so no walking. Okay. Again, so this is a way we don't actually apply the cautionary principle. And it's one of those things where, sometimes it's better safe than sorry, right? But usually it's better safe than sorry when being safe doesn't have other kinds of opportunity costs, right? And so that's the sense in which I think an argument like this one does sort of abuse the cautionary principle. Frey himself argues that we just have no reason, right, to presume that animal lives are of equal richness to human lives, and he gives two reasons for this. He says one of those is because we have evidence to the contrary. Okay, we have evidence about their behavior, right? We have evidence about their cognitive capabilities, right? Animals are generally, many non-human animals are very well studied. Okay, and so he says this isn't one of those cases where we have no information, and so we may as well just sort of adopt the safe perspective. He says we have information, and most of that information seems to favor a given conclusion about the lives of animals. And two, he's like, why should we think that all animals have lives equal in richness to our own when we don't even think all humans have lives that are equal in richness to other humans, right? We don't even think all human lives are of equal richness. Okay, so that's I think again two very fair points, right? So he's going to take this argument on its fact premise, not its value premise, right? Which you could do either, I think. Okay, and so one of the other criticisms that he's concerned to defend the unequal value thesis from is the charge of speciesism, and this is going to be the main part of his discussion. So we're going to be talking about what speciesism is and why he sort of why he thinks he can defend his thesis without being a speciesist. Okay, so speciesism, okay, is the view that one being is more morally important than another because of what biological species it belongs to, right? That's the view, okay? And it seems like this would be a bad view to have, because if you were a speciesist, speciesism seems bad, because species, considered by itself, is probably as morally irrelevant as race, color, sex, height, or age. Okay, all of these things seem to be morally irrelevant because simply biological. Species also seems to be simply biological, right? Simply it means to be a biological fact. And Frey doesn't spend any time arguing this, okay, because he relies on other people who argue about this. He relies on the reader to be at least somewhat familiar with people who have argued that speciesism is bad, and it's just as bad as, racism, sexism, ageism, heightism, whatever kind of thing you want. And so I'll try and supply a little bit of that now. So consider a couple of a couple of thought experiments, all right? So one thought experiment is one that we've done many hundreds of times in every, it's like science fiction book, TV series, movie, etc. Okay, so imagine that you're watching some television show, and on this television show there are aliens, intelligent aliens. They act in such a way that makes us think that they live lives that are comprehensible to us, right? The kinds of things that they want are comprehensible to us. They make sense. They're sort of things that we would sort of want out of our lives. They look for meaning, they have friends, they have families, they have, etc., right? They have many of the things that we have and find valuable, and they appear to find those things valuable as well. It gets to the point where we have enough in common, we can even talk to each other, right? So the idea is that, a human and, say, a Klingon, for example, I mean, is it morally justified to sort of, use Klingons for medical research, or, just to kill them and eat them, or, something like that? I mean, I think the obvious answer is like, well, no. And of course we sort of write that into our scripts. We're like, yes, okay, they're not humans, okay, but they have lives of comparable richness to humans, and so they're morally comparable to humans, right? That's an idea. And so to say, oh no, humans first, and Klingons, they're just animals or something like that. They don't count morally speaking. That would seem very much like racism, right? It would seem very much like sexism or some other sort of arbitrary distinction on the basis of a biological fact rather than a moral fact. Okay, so that's one thing. You might imagine, other kinds of science fiction scenarios involving various kinds of non-human animals that have been the subject of some form of genetic manipulation, right? Such that their capabilities, right, cognitive and otherwise, are enhanced, right? So perhaps like the raccoon from the Marvel universe, right? Rocket, or you can probably think of, if you're a real science fiction junkie, any number of another handful of examples of this, right? And you might want to say, okay, look, say for example, David Brin's Uplift series, right? It's all full of these, right? Again, the idea is that if you've got these creatures that really do, right, have through their enhanced capabilities, okay, have a life of comparable richness to yours or mine, they'll of course display all kinds of evidence of having those rich and complex lives that we have, and also saying something about just their biological species would again seem to be morally irrelevant. Okay, so I think through a couple of thought experiments of that kind, you can sort of see, oh yeah, mere biological facts, right, like height, right, are morally irrelevant, and sort of always have been, even though people have not always realized that, right? There's certainly plenty of racism, sexism, etc. in our present and past. So in any case, Frey is going to consider this to be a very serious problem, right? He says that, look, if the unequal value is a species, if the unequal value thesis is simply speciesist, then that would be a good reason not to have that view. Okay. Right, in fact, this is how he puts it. He says, if a defense of the unequal value thesis is open to the charge of speciesism, then it is no defense at all. Okay, he does take this objection very, very seriously. And so what his goal then becomes is to explain how he can defend the view, right, that not all, that in general human life is more valuable than animal life, is not based on anything about species, right? It's not based on any biological fact, at least not at base on any biological fact. And so there's a little bit of background here that I feel like I should also fill in. Again, these are some things that I think Frey counts on his reader to be somewhat familiar with, and that you are actually somewhat familiar with, and that is these marginal cases arguments. Norcross absolutely mentions these. Singer very famously mentions these, what are called marginal cases arguments. And so the marginal case argument works kind of like this, okay? The marginal case argument says, okay, if I say, right, it's wrong to use animals for research or anything like that, or to kill them and eat them, and you say, well, look, that's okay because they're not rational or something like that. They don't have any of the psychological characteristics that we associate with, moral subjects or something like that. Then Singer and Norcross, etc., will say, okay, look, if you justify using animals for research because they don't have reason, then we should also have no objection to using infants and mentally deficient humans for the same purpose. And of course, that strikes most people as, sort of abhorrent, and so that sort of turns the table. And so then to deny this implication would then be speciesism. You say, no, 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 it's different if they're human and don't have any mental capacities or don't have rationality. You know, and because it seems like the only way to say, okay, look, you can use rabbits for medical research because they're not rational, but you can't use mentally deficient humans for medical research because they're humans, right? I mean, that again, that's plainly speciesist, and so that's the accusation of the marginal cases argument, is to say that if you really were talking about rationality, then you'd have to talk about these marginal cases, that is, humans who have unfortunate conditions of mental deficiency or a lack of rationality, and you'd have to consider using them as well, right? If it's really about the rationality, but Singer and Norcross don't suspect that it's about rationality; they suspect it's just about species, which Frey here agrees is morally arbitrary. And so this is when people reply to something like the marginal cases argument, right? There are a couple of really common replies. One of those really common replies is to sort of deny, okay, that you can use mentally deficient humans for research, and then also to deny that such a view is speciesist, right? You say, no, 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 it's not because they're human and the rabbit isn't. It's for some other reason, right? And in my experience, such arguments have generally been pretty weak. It's not like I don't. There may be some good ones out there. I haven't seen any that I find to be tremendously convincing, but it is one common reply. So another reply, I think the more common reply, is to simply claim that there's nothing wrong with speciesism. It's to defend it in some sense, to say no, 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 species is morally relevant, and that's that, right? And so again, I myself am uncomfortable with such arguments, right? I'm more or less convinced by the idea that for the reasons that I said when talking about the about speciesism, that just mere biological facts probably are morally irrelevant or morally arbitrary, and that there's not a great deal of difference discriminating on the basis of species than there is discriminating on the basis of height, right? So again, it's a reply, okay, but I think Frey here is going to give us a different reply. Right, it's not going to do one of these other two traditional things. His reply, I'm going to use his own words for this one, is more or less as follows. He says, because some human lives fall drastically below the quality of life of normal adult human life, we must face the prospect that the lives of some perfectly healthy animals have a higher quality and greater value than the lives of some humans. And we must face the prospect, with all the implications it may have for the use of these unfortunate humans by others, at least if we continue to justify the use of animals in medical or scientific research by appeal to the lower quality and value of their lives. A rather striking response, actually, a very surprising, I think, in some ways, because essentially what he does is he simply accepts the marginal cases argument. Right, this is a very different way of replying. Instead of denying, right, that he's being a speciesist, and still saying, okay, you can't use certain kinds of mentally deficient humans for medical research, or saying, well, look, there's nothing wrong with speciesism. He says, no, look, it's true that at least some animals will have lives of higher quality than at least some humans. So that's simply a fact, right? And so there may not be a very good moral reason not to use humans in some cases for medical research, right? And that's, again, a surprising view. He's going to defend the view, or at least talk about a possible defense of the view. This is not his main purpose, in this way. And so he says, look, if you're going to contemplate, right, the use of anything for medical research, you have to consider a certain number of factors. He says, here are the factors that must come under consideration when determining whether to use anything for research purposes, right? He says, number one, you have to consider the nature and size of the expected benefit. Okay, and so again, this is going to reveal something about Frey's account here. Frey is also, just like Norcross, a consequentialist, right? They both adopt the view that the action with the best overall consequences is the action that is required. And so if we're going to be using anything, whether human or animal, for medical research, we have to consider, right, what the nature and size of the expected benefit of that research is. You have to consider the side effects that any decision to use humans in preference to animals may evoke. Okay, so here's the kind of thing I imagine he has in mind here. So imagine, right, that you allow acephalic or encephalic human beings, that is, humans who are born without a brain. It's a rare, but it does happen. It's known to medicine. Imagine you allow humans who are born without any brains to be used for some kinds of medical research, right? Because they do, in fact, have human bodies, right, in every other respect. You know, they otherwise have, as far as we like, absolutely no capacity for sensation. Okay, I mean, or you know, certainly no richness to a life, right? Such folks. People who are born in that state generally don't survive independently of mechanical support and don't generally live very long. It's you know, just, you know, it's a very vegetative state in a sort of literal sense. It's very much like the life that a plant has. Living, yes, technically, but with no real experiences. So say that we decide that such beings are acceptable for use in medical research if that research would prove to teach us something that's very valuable and that could really improve lots of people's lives, if there's some real benefit to it. Okay, and such a case seems like the easiest of cases to make, right? That seems to be fairly straightforward. But of course, you want to say, all right, if using, right, humans in such a way, at least some humans in such a way, is a part of a place where we go, there's a number of what are called slippery slope arguments, and I want to caution about slippery slope arguments here. The slippery slope is actually, it's a fallacy. Okay, it's always a fallacy. There are no legitimate slippery slopes versus illegitimate slippery slopes. The slippery slope argument is always a fallacy of reasoning, because it always assumes that when you do one thing, it's going to lead you to some extreme and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So think of it this way. Imagine you decided to order pizza for dinner tonight, right? Well, look, you decided it was a good idea to have pizza tonight. What's going to stop you from ordering a pizza tomorrow too, right? Or even two pizzas. If you thought one pizza was good, why not two? And then the next day you're going to be ordering 3 pizzas, then the next day 4, and pretty soon you're going to be ordering more pizzas than you have money for, and you're going to your life is going to be ruined, and there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, I mean that's a slippery slope. Look, here's the thing about the real way that people actually make decisions. If you make a decision of a certain kind and it turns out well, you very well might make a very similar decision in the future, and for good reason, right? If you make a decision and it doesn't turn out that well, or you know, you make a decision and you know what you accomplished was done, right? So you know, so yeah, you order a pizza tomorrow, and then the next day you're like, well, I ordered pizza yesterday, I'll do something else, right? I mean, there you go, slippery slope done, right? Because you're making a decision at each step along the way. It's not like one decision just makes everything else happen all by itself. You still have decisions to make in the future, and those decisions can be to continue something that is you know, working, or not to continue it, or to discontinue something that isn't working, or you know, to just do something once in a while, like order a pizza. Okay, so again, all slippery slope arguments are fallacies. Okay, however, right, the idea is that you might, in terms of making laws, draw a kind of hard line so that it can prevent you from having to make the wrong decision in more marginal kinds of cases. Okay, so look, it might be very clear that an encephalic human, it's a person born without a brain, is not really a full moral subject, right? Is you know, it might plausibly be used for research, right? I think you could make that argument, and that might be a fairly easy case as far as these things go. But what about those with just brain damage of one kind or another, right? And you might say, look, from a legal point of view, how about we just say we're not going to do that at all, so that we don't then have to try and make determinations about how much brain damage is enough to subject one to medical research, because surely there are gray areas, and there are cases in which we're really just not sure and not comfortable pushing the limit. Okay, that's not exactly a slippery slope argument. That's a different kind of a thing. And so that's certainly the kind of side effect that he might be considering. He says, okay, if you're going to open it up at all, right, then there may be a chance in which you're going to have to examine cases that are going to be very problematic in one way or another. Okay, sure. But of course, that has to be balanced against point 3, right? The degree to which education and explanation might dissipate any such negative side effects, Okay, so the idea is, if we could, if we could sort of educate and sort of persuade and subject this to a kind of rational argument, an open deliberative process, right? Could that eliminate some of those side effects? Could we be confident in our ability to make good decisions as long as those decisions are made in a publicly, sort of rationally defensible way? Well, again, maybe, right? And then finally, you have to consider the projected reliability of animal results for the human case versus the projected reliability of human results for the human case. And this is one of those things where sometimes animal research doesn't do as much good as research on humans might do, simply because humans are not animals and animals are not humans. I mean, there are some disanalogies, right? There's some ways in which our biological systems are similar, which is why animal research works at all. But it's certainly not perfect, right? And again, that's a thing that has to be weighed. And so again, Frey here is going to he's going to say, look, one of the things that you have to do is you have to stop pretending that species really is, okay, this ultimate sort of barrier line, and he says instead you really have to be looking case by case at the richness and value of a life versus what other kinds of benefits and results there are available. He's a pure consequentialist here, just like Norcross, just like Singer. In fact, he puts it this way. He says, some human lives are so very deficient in quality that we would not wish those lives upon anyone. And there are few lengths to which we would not go in order to avoid such lives for ourselves and for our loved ones. I can see little point in pretending that lives which we would do everything we could to avoid are of equal value to those normal adult human lives that we are presently living. I acknowledge the difficulty in determining in many cases when a life is no longer worth living. In other cases, however, such as an elderly person completely undone by Alzheimer's disease, or an infant born with no or only half a brain, the matter seems far less problematic. And so he's going to follow this general point, right, about deciding who or what to use in research and why, with a couple of notes about what can be called special moral standing, right? And so he, again, is going to acknowledge that we do have the sense that we stand in special moral relations to some, but not others, okay? And the example he gives is, when we decide to whom we would give a kidney, right? Giving kidney to our daughter, but perhaps not a stranger, okay? So it does very much seem in our common sense morality like we do have some special moral standing with some individuals rather than with others. And Frey thinks that this is a result of reflection and of autonomy, okay, and not as a matter of something as sweeping and automatic as species membership, okay. He thinks that there's no sense in which we bear any special moral standing toward anything, any other members of just our own species, right? It's that we stand a special moral relationship to certainly those who have lives with comparable richness to ours, but that doesn't have anything to do with their species, it taken in and of itself. Right. So he agrees with Norcross and Singer and others that again the value of a life is not in its species membership, but instead he thinks it's in this notion of autonomy, choice, right? That sort of thing. And so at this point, he's going to consider what's, I think, the most interesting objection of the paper, the most interesting issue of the paper, where he points to two different versions of speciesism, right? And so he says, here's one of them, which I clearly don't subscribe to, but the other I might be accused of. All right, so direct speciesism, okay, is discrimination purely on the basis of species membership. It says, well, because morality applies to only humans, so nothing else, right? No Klingons, no dogs, no cats, nothing, right? That's direct speciesism. That direct speciesism regards the species membership all by itself as morally relevant, okay? And Frey clearly disagrees with that view, and again, Norcross and Singer and others would disagree with that view as well, right? They and Frey are all on the same page. But then there's indirect speciesism, okay? And this is a kind of discrimination based on selecting human criteria for a rich and valuable life. So the point is that what's going on is that certainly Frey is not saying, right, that that just being human has any moral value in and of itself, but he is saying that having a life of richness and complexity has value in and of itself. Now, of course, if you're defining richness and complexity in a way that humans, like, there's like, oh, you mean being like humans, right? Isn't that speciesism? Okay, that's the question here. It's a very interesting question. Okay, so again, he demonstrates he does not subscribe to the direct view, but is he an indirect speciesist? Okay, and that's what he's going to turn his attention to in the last piece of the paper. And his reply is again complex, multifaceted, and very interesting. And so he says, look, on the one hand, okay, the view that we know nothing of what, for example, rabbits find valuable or enriching does not really advance the idea that their lives are rich or valuable. Again, we have all kinds of data about what their lives are more or less like, and none of that indicates this sort of richness or complexity. Okay, he says, look, on the other hand, what we do know indicates that though rabbits have capabilities that we lack, so such a much better sense of smell, for example, these capabilities are not the sort of things that bestow richness on a life, right? He thinks that you can look at this in a fairly objective way that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with being human. It's not like you have to be human to understand what choice is or isn't, right? Or it's not like you have to be human to understand, differing perceptions of the good. Okay, so I want to try and explain it sort of this way. So imagine the lives of something like, dogs, right? Dogs are probably pretty familiar to you all. There's a number of a couple of different ways you might imagine the inner life of a dog, or the way that a dog tends to regard its own life. You could say that on the one hand, perhaps they do have very sort of, rich and varied inner lives, but they're lives that we just don't comprehend. Okay, and so we see here, dogs at some birthday party, or whatever. Again, that's a human construct still, but the idea is that we imagine them as having their own inner life. They do things for their own reasons, and for some reason they just like the smell of butts, right? I mean, it's just like, oh, that's great, and dogs do seem to do that, and so maybe it's that their lives really are rich and varied and complex and all that sort of stuff, and we just don't understand them. Okay, right? That's one possibility. And if we say, no, the lives that are valuable are the kinds of lives that we understand, that would be being an indirect speciesist. Okay? Frey doesn't think this is really what's going on here, right? He doesn't think, no, there's these rich and complex lives that are just incomprehensible to us. The philosopher Wittgenstein once sort of famously quipped, he says, look, if a lion could talk, you'd never understand it, right? Because you just don't share a form of life. So again, Frey doesn't think that's what's going on here. He thinks what's going on is that we do actually pretty much understand their lives, and we have a very good understanding of what kind of richness their lives do and don't have. And so, sort of a different cartoon comes in for that kind of a perspective. So if you can't read that text, I'll just go ahead and read it for you in this first frame here. I've got, let's get my little laser pointer here. So in the first frame here, it says that, the dog, there's obviously this dog genie, right? It says, hey, I wish I could speak and understand my human's language, right? And so, of course, the genie must have granted the wish, because here he is. He says, guys, finally, I have to tell you something. And, of course, the humans are quite surprised, like, whoa, Duke can talk, right? And, holy crap. And so then the dog has this very important thing that he wants to tell them. He says, when I'm whining at the table, it's because I want you to give me some of the food you're eating. Right? Like, this is, he thinks they just must not know, right? And they say, oh, Duke, buddy, we know that. He says, look, we don't want to give you that food. And of course, the dog is quite surprised. What? Right? So that's, again, is what's really going on that we actually quite understand the kind of lives more or less that animals lead pretty well, right? We understand that there's a kind of lack of comprehension of a lot of higher concepts, like, why wouldn't you want to give your dog human food? It's like, well, because it's good for their overall well-being in the long run. People food and dog food, or people and dogs have different nutritional needs, and etc. Right? To say nothing of trying to encourage habits at the table where dogs are sort of begging or trying to steal people's food or things like that. I mean, like, there's all kinds of these extra reasons that I think we're very confident that dogs just don't get, right? So that's kind of what Frey's response is. He says that, look, he says, if you're not directly comparing, using species as a morally relevant category, you're not a speciesist, okay? And it's not speciesism to talk about the richness and complexity of lives, right? He thinks that it's very clear that it isn't. And so one other thing I think Frey could have said is that this accusation of sort of indirect speciesism is pretty double-edged. I think that it has a sort of an unforeseen downside for someone who wants to advance this kind of an argument. Because what it can do is it can undermine support for the idea that suffering is equally bad for humans and for animals. If you want to say, okay, look, you just don't know what's good and bad for animals, and so, et cetera, then it's like, okay, look, if I can no longer say anything about the richness or complexity of animal lives, I actually think that also means I can't say anything about what kinds of physical sensations they have or don't have, or whether those are good or bad for them. Okay, so the evidence that I have for animal suffering being bad for them, for the animals, is about how they behave. Okay, and about my assumptions about what their lives are like. And if I can't make any of those kinds of assumptions, well, then I can't even assume that pain is bad for them. And certainly that's not a position that say Norcross or Singer or anybody else who cares about advancing a case against speciesism would want to adopt. So again, I think that's a reply that certainly Frey could have made. And so to sum this up, I want to do a couple of things. One of those two things is to recommend some extra reading on this particular topic. Peter Singer's article "All Animals Are Equal" is a classic in the genre, and if you're really interested in these kinds of issues, you should definitely know that article, right? Also, I think my very favorite article, replying right to the kind of position that Singer or that Norcross give us, the kind of utilitarian position, is not entirely dissimilar here to R.G. Frey's position, but it's, I feel, expressed in a different way that I think is valuable and important. And that's Ruth Sigmund's very excellent article, "Death, Misfortune, and Species Inequality." Because you'll notice that one of the things that R.G. Frey here doesn't really respond to so much is something that's very important to Norcross, and that is, can you kill and eat animals, right? He doesn't really give a direct response. You might imagine what his response is, given what he says about other cases like research and things like that. But he doesn't really address that. Sigmund addresses that issue much more directly. But in the end here, I want to say that this is, again, supposed to be an exercise in applied ethics. Right, and so think to yourself, what kind of a disagreement is this, right? And I think it should be very clear that this is a disagreement between different versions of the same kind of ethical theory. Again, Norcross is very clearly a utilitarian, okay, and Frey is very clearly a utilitarian as well, right? He's just a utilitarian of a slightly different kind. He's a utilitarian much more like John Stuart Mill, who thought that the quantity of pleasure wasn't the only thing that mattered, but also the quality of pleasure. And that's something that Frey brings in, that he thinks that Norcross, Singer, and others who are more classic utilitarians in the style of Bentham leave out, right? They tend to look at things as only quantities of sort of pleasures or pains, and don't look at sort of the quality of the pleasure or pain that goes in there. Sigmund has a very similar view to Frey's, right? She'll argue in the favor of a sort of quality, not just quantity utilitarian, right? Now, here's one other thing I wanted to point out about that before closing remarks. It's that if somebody gives you a kind of moral case based on utilitarianism, one very common way that you could respond to that case would be by considering the idea that the morality of an issue is not determined by its consequences, right? But instead, you have to worry about what sort of rights or duties, or even if you're a virtue ethicist, what kind of personal character is involved here. And so notice one of the things that people tend to really not like about, say, Kant's moral approach is that Kant has a really hard time saying that we owe animals something, and it seems like we owe them something, right? Kant has a really hard time distinguishing between moral agents and mere moral subjects, while utilitarianism doesn't so much have a hard time doing that. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the best arguments against some of the utilitarian animal rights arguments are just different kinds of utilitarians and not necessarily Kantians. And so this is another example where you can take something that you already know about how moral theories are argued, about things that they do well, about things they don't do well, about things people like about them and don't like about them, to sort of anticipate what kind of an approach might be the best way to be skeptical, right, about a particular kind of moral argument, and to to raise legitimate and reasonable concerns about that argument so that we can then make a kind of moral progress and then and be able to really think about these issues as carefully as they deserve, right? Because all moral issues are important, right? There's nothing that's more important than thinking about morality in an appropriate way and being able to try and make sure that we've thought about things as thoroughly as we need to. All right, the last thing I just want to mention in connection with all of these articles, and I've sort of put it here at a remove, is that there's a really excellent article by Thomas Nagel that's called Death, right? It's one of the better titles for a piece of philosophy, but it's really excellent. And it talks about just what's so bad about being dead, right? And this is one of those things where, as utilitarians, I think there's a certain amount of skirting around a very interesting issue, because if you go all the way back to Epicurus, a hedonist who says, look, death is nothing, right? It's neither good, it's nor bad. It's the absence of any experience. How could it be good or bad if we think that the good or bad is just based on experience, namely pleasure? Death isn't pleasurable. It's not painful. That means it's nothing. And so when we talk about sort of, say, for example, person or animal death, right? What is a utilitarian supposed to make of that? And Thomas Nagel's account of, the sort of badness of death, if it is even that, is going to be one that's going to, you'll see it sort of very subtly inform not only Singer's arguments, but also Norcross's arguments, Sigmund's arguments, and Frey's arguments. And so it's a sort of very important backdrop if you're sort of interested in such things. And it's the kind of article that will sort of stick with you and you can apply to lots and lots and lots of different kinds of cases because it is so well thought out and well argued. All right, so that being said, the last thing I'd like to leave you with is just a note to again, when you're dealing with issues of applied ethics, you should think, okay, where is this person coming from, and what do I already know about a moral perspective that's like that one? Okay, what tends to be the best way to think critically about that kind of a moral perspective, and about what's good about it and what's bad about it, and where things going. And if you're thinking critically about moral issues, look, whether you reach some sort of a determination that's definite or not, like, that's not the point. Okay, look, if you take an intro to physics class, are you supposed to just know everything about the whole universe? No, that would be ridiculous. But what you're supposed to have is a set of tools by which you can start investigating it and understanding how other people are investigating it. You take a history class, are you supposed to just know everything that ever happened? Of course not. You're supposed to have a set of tools, right, for trying to discover such. You're supposed to have a set of, you're supposed to be able to appreciate the way that other people have gone about trying to figure out what happened and why it happened and what we can learn from it. Okay, so likewise in ethics, it's not important. Like, you don't take an ethics class and think, oh, I'm just going to know all of the moral facts, right? That would be ridiculous, just as ridiculous as those other things. But what you should be able to do is use a set of tools to take the categories of right and wrong seriously. And if you're taking the categories of right and wrong seriously, and applying the kinds of tools that have been have survived the test of time, they've been proven by some very, very smart people over a very long period of time to be reasonable and sensible. If those are the kinds of tools you're using, then that's progress. Right? That really is better than not doing those things, and that's what it can make us all better human beings, or really just better moral beings, right? Because being human is neither here nor there. And so given that, right, those are issues here, and so think carefully about how to apply these sorts of things to your final paper assignment and to other kinds of ethical issues that you come across in your daily life.